Hi everyone, welcome to our second video. This video is titled Sites of Production, and we'll look at where women found employment during the early modern era. As I mentioned in the last video, many women in this time period had to work. While young, women worked to help support their parents and siblings or to self-fund their dowry, while at the same time also acquiring skills that would be appealing to a potential husband. Then, later in life, while married, they often worked to augment their husband's income or assist in keeping his business running. In this video, we're going to look at how the opportunities available to women differed between rural and urban-based women. Before we start looking at the employment opportunities available to women based on their location, I want to talk a little bit about the strong cultural association that existed between women and the textile arts, because in many ways, women's association with textiles spanned both the rural and urban opportunities women had for work. The first thing I want you all to understand is that this association between women and the textile arts, by which I mean spinning thread, weaving cloth, sewing or mending clothing and home goods, and creating decorative items using techniques like embroidery, was that it was very strong and it persisted well into the industrial age. For example, I have a couple images of Queen Victoria. The first is a picture where you can see she's later in life, probably already widowed, and she's shown posing with a spinning wheel, apparently to show the public that she was not neglecting her duties to her household, even though she was the reigning monarch of England, in essence, setting a good example for her people. And this is not the only image depicting Queen Victoria spinning. Another depiction I really like is shown here, and it's a bronze sculpture showing her as a much younger woman, also posing with her spinning wheel. So just keep in mind as we continue this discussion of women and their association with the textile arts, that this was a social understanding that was very pervasive and had a lot of staying power in European society. Now, getting back to the early modern era, all women would have been expected to have some degree of an education within the textile arts, although exactly which skills and how much of them would have been class specific. This concept should sound fairly familiar to you. The lecture about female writers discussed the idea that women should be given a class-specific education, one that would enable them to be productive if their familial support system failed. But even absent a formalized education, there nevertheless existed this expectation that women would bring to marriage certain skills related to household management, among them the skills to at least create and maintain textile goods. Whenever I'm thinking about this topic, Proverbs 16:27 always comes to mind, and this is the proverb that starts with the phrase, "idle hands are the devil's workshop," because certainly there was this fear in this era that absent of something productive to do, women were going to get into mischief. So even wealthy women were expected to be industrious with their downtime. Women in the upper classes would have been expected to spend at least some of their time producing richly decorated items and clothing for their households and as gift for their friends. You can see one famous example on your screen right now. This is a prayer book embroidered by Queen Elizabeth I for her father's last wife, Catherine Parr. Another story you've no doubt already heard is that of Queen Isabella Castile, famously mending her husband's clothing in public, demonstrating that she was both a queen and a dutiful wife. A story I feel strongly echoes the photo we looked at a minute ago of the much later Queen Victoria, once again demonstrating how pervasive this association between women and cloth really was. I have a couple photos of embroidery I want to show you too. So keeping all that in mind, if you look on your screen now, what you see is an example of a very high level of embroidery. So this would have been applique work. So the blues and golds you see, as well as the greens and the creams, those are smaller pieces cut from another cloth, then attached to that red background fabric using decorative embroidery stitches. This is the kind of decoration that would have gone on either household items or clothing items of the very wealthy. Unlike something that a more middle-class woman might have been likely to wear, like you'll see in this next photo, this is also embroidery, although obviously it's lacking the extra bits of cloth that are being applied down. This is called black work, so it was actually a counted type of embroidery, so there was an even number of threads in the background and women could count their stitches to get a really even pattern. It was very popular in the Elizabethan era. I wanted to show you these images of early modern embroidery so you could get a sense of how adaptable embroidery, like the rest of the textile arts, really were when it came to making them appropriate for different social classes. And this is an important point, because less affluent women would have also been expected to refrain from being idle in their downtime. But producing decorative items or clothing for their own households was potentially problematic. It could be seen as appropriating the hallmarks of the upper classes. And in fact, sumptuary legislation, which were legal codes that restricted clothing and decorative items based on social class, was in effect for much of the early modern era. So depending on exactly when and what country we're talking about, it might have even been illegal for less affluent women or their families to own such items for personal use. However, this became an area where a smart and socially aware woman could work within social constraints to find empowerment. By mastering skills like embroidery and producing beautifully decorated items for sale, showing she was both modest and industrious, she enhanced both her reputation as a wife and her husband's reputation as the kind of man that maintained such a productive household. Not to mention, the creation of such decorative items for sale took advantage of the growing fervor among the upper echelons of society for luxury items, making the best of the changing social realities and potentially uncovering a new source of income. So as we can see, women were able to use their skills in the textile arts to present themselves, and by association their husbands or fathers, positively to society, while also potentially making some much-needed income. But that's not the only benefit that women gained from this association between women and the textile arts. Additionally, this association created an avenue for women to find employment within the formal textile manufacturing industry. This is a big deal, especially the later we get in the period, as more and more industries moved towards more formal manufacturing, and as more manufactured goods became available and made homemade products less competitive. This association was able to help women overcome the unease regarding women in public and created job opportunities. But I want to be really careful to mention that while this association helped women get jobs in public spaces, like in the textile industry, there were still a lot of misgivings about women working outside of the home, necessary or not. I want to share with you an illustration that I think really demonstrates this unease that women working in the public faced. So take a look. This is an 18th century engraving. It's from the 1740s, and it shows women working in a milliner's shop. Millinery was it's associated with hats, but really what millinery stores did is they sold ribbon and trims and the kind of things you would use to dress up your clothing. So they largely catered to women, and they were largely run by women. So it was an easy place for women looking for work to find employment. However, as you can see in this image, the concern was that women as shopkeepers were going to encounter leering men, I'll put it that way, that there was this moral pitfall that was associated with customer service. The woman was in a position where she had to be polite and she had to engage with a male customer despite what might have been inappropriate behavior. I think this picture shows pretty clearly that this man does not have, clean intentions. So you can really get a sense from this image the kinds of concerns that women in public spaces working was really starting to engender. General uneasiness aside, this cultural association still paved the way for women to find work outside of the home in formal industry. As Claire Croston so eloquently phrased it, cultural notions of appropriate female tasks surpassed legal strictures, encouraging male employers to hire women in sectors from which they were theoretically forbidden. In addition to this general unease regarding women working in public, the growth in women working outside of the home faced complications from the rise of guilds, which, like the association between women and textiles, also had implications for both rural and urban-based women looking for work. Guilds were institutions that had legal control over a particular trade. They weren't new, they had existed since the medieval period, but had gained considerable strength as the early modern era wore on, and the production of goods shifted from homes to dedicated sites of production. For this lecture, the most important thing to understand about the guild system is the guilds organized and oversaw all aspects of their trade, from regulating formal training for people seeking to participate in their trade, to monitoring the quality of manufactured items and the amounts of an item produced, down to the prices their goods sold for. Guilds' monopoly over their trades even extended to the ability to issue rules limiting who guild members could employ. Since women earned less money than their male counterparts, guild workers petitioned repeatedly to eliminate women from industrial jobs out of fear they would be supplanted by female employees. However, within the textile industry, guilds were never able to overcome the cultural association between women and textiles, and their efforts completely failed to eliminate women from working in the industry. An example of this can be seen within the tailoring industry, which is the industry that sewed cloth into clothing. Tailoring had the potential to be very lucrative, as clothing was very expensive for much of the early modern period, and tailors were able to charge a steep markup on the raw materials they supplied to their customers. However, despite the tailoring guild's best efforts, they were never able to fully suppress female tailors, who were called seamstresses. In fact, both England and France passed legislation allowing for women to work as seamstresses, as long as they didn't infringe on the tailoring guild by accepting commissions for courtwear or men's clothing. In France, seamstresses were even given formal permission to form their own guild. Now that we've looked at how the association between women and the textile arts created room for women to find work even though it seemingly clashed with the perceived ideal, let's take a closer look at the opportunities women had for employment in rural and urban settings. Since we've just been talking about guilds and the cultural association between women and the textile arts, let's look at manufacturing jobs for women first. The majority of the manufacturing jobs available to women were available in urban centers, since that's where most of the manufacturing sites chose to set up, so as to have access to a larger pool of labor. Some women holding manufacturing jobs worked for their husbands or other family members, but not all. And the vast majority of manufacturing jobs available to women in the urban areas were in the textile industry. And these roles could include everything from the processing of raw materials through the production of clothing, and then finally finish work like decorating that clothing with things like embroidery or possibly lace making. One of the things that I found most surprising when I started researching 18th century industry was what it took to create quilted petticoats for women. So quilted petticoats were incredibly popular items of clothing, and they were skirts. Often they were worn under, so you couldn't even see them, under whatever outfit the woman was wearing. And they were created by layering multiple pieces of fabric together and then anchoring those layers of fabric together using decorative stitching. I found a contemporary description of what these manufacturing operations looked like. They would literally have the layers of fabric stretched out on some kind of a frame, and they might have had 5, 8, 10 women all crowded around it working on quilting this one piece of what ultimately would become one piece of fabric to try and move through the quilted petticoats as fast as possible. So again, not glamorous, but there was a lot of need for women to be in these industries. Now, throughout the early modern period, one of the roles in the textile industry that did end up somewhat shut to women, although not entirely, was the physical weaving of cloth. And the reason this became less associated with women is due to technological advances in the types of looms used to weave cloth. They became much bigger in this period, and they were able to start making much wider pieces of cloth than they had before, but operating the looms took a lot more physical strength. Now, spinning, on the other hand, which is where raw materials are turned into the thread that is then used to weave cloth, didn't experience the same type of technological advancements. So while spinning wasn't a particularly skilled task, it was very labor intensive, and it became the bottleneck in the cloth manufacturing process. It took approximately 20 women spinning to keep one weaver in production. And despite how much potential this had for slowing down the weaving process, spinning never became a male occupation in urban centers. For this reason, it provided a constant source of employment for women. While at face value this might not seem like much of a positive, and it was a pretty poorly paid role, it nevertheless kept a source of income available for women who were struggling to find gainful employment. Think of people like single mothers or widows who didn't really have any family or social connections behind them. Fun fact, if any of you have heard the phrase spinster, the kind of not nice designator for middle-aged or older unmarried women, it actually stems from spinning and this association. Cities would actually operate rooms where it was filled with city-owned spinning wheels, and the city would provide anyone who came with the raw materials to turn into thread, and then they'd pay the women who were running these wheels per amount of thread they were able to make. So these city-run spinning wheels collected a rather motley group of women who really just needed some kind of employment. So that's what manufacturing looked like in the urban centers. In rural areas, there was less in the way of manufacturing, and what did exist was mostly available in what was called cottage industries. So cottage industries manufactured highly specialized products like specific kinds of lace or specific kinds of foodstuff. These cottage industries were often localized, so it would be a particular region associated with a particular product. And cottage industries were often illegal, so they ran afoul of guild regulations, and as such, weren't exactly a stable form of employment. Now, guilds did often tacitly allow for these operations to exist, sometimes even purchasing manufactured goods from them directly. And merchants, the people who were selling goods to the public, were very interested in encouraging rural production of items because they wanted to circumvent guild controls and pricing. So, in this view, merchants would supply raw materials to a rural household who would then produce a saleable good. This was called the putting out system. Guild control, cottage industries, and the putting out system created a gray area of women's work, where they were allowed to work in these industries, but were technically engaging in legal activities. And at any point, the guilds could press the issue. And in times of economic downturn, guilds would do everything they could to cut off these illegal forms of manufacturing. But nevertheless, these slightly below-board opportunities provided skilled rural women a way to contribute financially to their families. The last type of work we're going to cover in this video is domestic work, which, like manufacturing, also existed in both rural and urban settings, although it looked fairly different in both areas. Starting with urban centers, nearly 12% of the population of any major European city was comprised of female domestics. This number was that high because female domestics were cheap labor, and often would be the first affordable luxury a family doing well financially would choose to afford for themselves. Female domestics were often compensated not just with their wages, but also with room and board in their employers' homes, which gave them the ability to save up money. However, it also put them in a fairly precarious situation. There was little in the way of protections for them if they were either sexually assaulted or started an affair with their employer, and were frequently dismissed if they became pregnant. Rural domestic work, on the other hand, had a more personal aspect to it. Securing these jobs often required having a stellar reputation, as well as a community member willing to vouch for you. And many rural women followed established migratory patterns, meaning that when they moved for work, they moved to an area where other young people from their community traditionally went to work, so they still had community support. They also might be working as a domestic servant at a farm where their brothers or cousins worked seasonally harvesting crops, so they still had close family associations. And thus ends our discussion of early modern women and their work opportunities. Hopefully through this video you got a sense of how social expectations and changing economic realities function together to limit the types of economic opportunities available to women, and how women operated within these constraints to find sources of income to support themselves and their families. Thank you for watching this video. The next and final video you'll be watching is titled Marcus's Metaphors.